Okay, welcome to the last video for this week. We're going to talk a little bit about gambling addiction or problem gambling. This is something that I think needs to be discussed for sure in this class. Something that I could spend a lot more time on, but frankly, I don't feel like I'm qualified to do that. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an addiction medicine specialist or something. So what I want to do is just give you just some basic information about what we know about gambling addiction at its core, and think about how casinos respond to the information that we have for gambling addiction. First, let me define addiction, because you should recognize that addiction is actually a pretty hard thing to define. If you try to define addiction right now, I bet you would have a very different answer from a lot of your peers. So addiction can be defined as, using sort of the medical definition, as continued use or engagement in an activity despite a desire to quit or significant adverse consequences. So to be considered an addict, you need to either be trying to quit but can't, so you're unable to control your impulses, or perhaps you have negative consequences that are really affecting your life dramatically and you're not doing anything to stop. So what you should recognize then is doing something a lot doesn't necessarily make you an addict. So someone who drinks 6 beers a day is not necessarily a gambling addict. And somebody who only drinks once a month is not necessarily not an addict. If this person who only drinks once a month, drinks and drive, cheats on their spouse, does something dramatic like that, and then continues to drink, even if it's only once a month, we might call them a drinking addict. So the amount of use that you have doesn't necessarily show whether or not you're an addict. And I think that's most obvious with gambling. Someone who goes to casinos all the time, that doesn't really mean that they have a problem, right? And we can really say the same thing with alcohol. There's a lot of things you can do that are bad for you. I'm sure a lot of us could eat better. So a habit like drinking 6 beers a day is obviously unhealthy, but unless it fits this criteria, the medical community wouldn't call it an addiction. We should also make a clarification here that addiction and dependence are usually not considered the same thing. So dependence means basically a chemical need to continue using a drug. Usually we think about dependence when we're thinking about drugs. And sometimes, even the medical community, from what I've read and what I've learned, even the medical community sometimes has trouble deciding when to use these terms. But the basic thing to recognize here is that everyone can be dependent. Everyone can be dependent on something. If I give you some really strong drugs, if I give you some barbiturates or something continuously over and over again, you will become dependent. Perhaps you don't know this. With alcohol, there's a big difference between being dependent on alcohol and being an alcohol addict. This person here is certainly not dependent on alcohol, and this person probably isn't either. But everyone can be dependent. If you drink a beer every 30 minutes for 2 weeks straight, you will develop a dependence. And what that means is if you stop drinking, you will face withdrawals. And in the case of alcohol, these withdrawals are significant. If you've been drinking continuously for, say, a year and you stop drinking, you'll often have convulsions, tremors, and all kinds of other side effects, and actually you may die. So if you're a true dependent drinker and you go to the hospital, they actually have to keep you drinking. They'll actually serve you beer as a requirement to keep you alive. That's dependence, okay? And addiction and dependence are not really the same thing. In both cases, you're probably using the drug a lot, but you can imagine that these two things are quite different. So in regards to addiction for gambling, certainly you can be a gambling addict But there are some arguments about whether or not you can be a gambling dependent. There are effects, there are actual physical effects that people go to if they stop gambling, but it's different from, say, alcohol. If you stop gambling, it's never going to kill you, but with alcohol, it actually can. So it turns out that the medical community is pretty much all on board with the idea of gambling addiction being a real thing, and we have some reasons to believe that. So I'm just going to try to give you some facts here about addiction. And let me just make a note right away that this is a very difficult field of study. The reason for that is if you've taken some econometrics or some statistics classes, you know that it's you need proper controls when doing a study. So you might try to figure out, are white people or black people more likely to become gambling addicts? Well, you would have to control for all kinds of things with it, doing that type of study, and it would end up being really tough to determine that. And that's the truth for just about all types of research in addiction. For example, one thing to keep in mind is that addictions are highly correlated with other mental health disorders. And trauma. So if you have some sort of mental health disorder, and then basically you can think of any mental health disorder you can imagine, it may make you more or less predisposed to be a gambling addict. Same deal with trauma. Gambling represents an escape, like a lot of drugs. So if you have a lot of trauma early on in your life, especially as a child, that makes you more likely to become a gambling addict. Well, think about the problem there then. If you're trying to figure out what determines gambling addiction, it's tough to say. If you really wanted to figure that out, what you would need to do is take a big group of people, another big group of people, and exert trauma on one group and not the other to create sort of a randomized experiment. There's no way to do that, right? That's incredibly unethical. Likewise, there's no way to sort of randomly sort people into some having mental health disorders and the other ones not. So it's often really hard to know what's going on. Are people gambling addicts because they happen to be addicts? Are they gambling addicts because of the trauma that was exerted on them? It's hard to suss these things out, okay? But here is what we know. These are warning signs. These are not necessarily causal effects. Having these warning signs doesn't necessarily cause you to be an addict, but it is correlated with being a gambling addict. This is pretty much true for all types of addiction. One of the biggest warning signs is addiction history in your family. You may not know this, but addictions are highly based on genes. They're highly hereditary. So alcohol addiction, basically, if one of your parents is an addict, you have about a 50% chance of having that addict gene as well, which basically means that if you start drinking alcohol a lot, you will become an addict. You're predisposed to that alcoholic condition. Not having parents as addicts doesn't necessarily exclude you from it, but it reduces the probability that you eventually will be considered an addict. So that's true for just about any type of addiction, whether we're talking about alcohol or sex or gambling. Family history is really important in sussing these things out. A typical warning sign is also just generally that you have impulsive behaviors, that you take a lot of risk, and you really desire lots of new activities. You can see that I wouldn't necessarily say that these are adverse conditions. These are not necessarily bad things. Someone who takes a lot of risk is not necessarily a problem. And certainly wanting to do new activities is not necessarily a problem. But these are all correlated with addiction. So these maybe not all bad to have these. And in fact, there's some thought that this type of risk-seeking behavior that these types of characteristics would have is actually evolutionarily considered a positive. Part of the reason that we believe that people are predisposed to addiction is it was a gene that got passed on because these people tended to be actually quite successful, especially in places where there's a significant amount of war or significant amount of trauma of some sort. It seems that these type of people tended to live more frequently. They tended to survive those types of things. And so the idea here is there's certain communities within our planet where people that were that had these types of traits were more likely to survive those that didn't have these traits, and thus these types of abilities got passed on. So these actually might be correlated with being survivors when things are very tough, but unfortunately they also predispose you to addiction. And so if you fit some of these qualifications here, you're more likely to be eventually characterized as an addict. And of course, last of all, if you have any other addiction, these things tend to move together. So if you have any other addiction, that tends to predispose you to gambling addiction, especially if it's an alcohol addiction. Turns out the people who are alcohol addicted, alcoholics, are more likely to end up gambling addicts than other forms of addiction. So it's a really strong warning sign. So these are the types of things you might look for if you're trying to assess your own or someone else's predisposition to gambling addiction. In terms of dealing with these problems, well, the treatments that are out there, there's Gamblers Anonymous, just like there's Alcoholics Anonymous and Marijuana Anonymous and so forth, Sexaholics Anonymous. There's various forms of dealing with these types of problems, and since gambling is a true addiction, there's many other support groups out there. Of course, things like therapy can potentially help, counseling. It's a lot of the same type of things that are suggested for other types of gambling or other types of addictions. So now let's talk about casinos. And obviously, casinos are in an awkward spot here. They can generate revenues by having addicts play their games, but also that's perhaps unethical. Maybe it might hurt their view from the general public. But they have done some things to try to curb addictive behavior, or at least they've tried to appear that they're doing that. If you go into any casino, you're going to find information on problem gambling. Oftentimes, little pamphlets that say something along the lines of winners know when to quit, or stop when it's not fun anymore, and there's some toll-free numbers available. You will find these often littered throughout the casino, these little pamphlets. The idea is there was more information, might cause people to question their behavior, or perhaps impulsively call one of these numbers to assess their own gambling addiction. A more direct route that these casinos have taken is something called self-exclusion. This is the act of intentionally making yourself ineligible to gamble at a casino. It's called self-exclusion, and as far as I know, pretty much all casinos offer this. If you can basically tell a casino, I don't want to play here anymore, so self-exclude me. I would like to self-exclude. And the casino will put you on a list where you are not allowed to play anymore. In some cases, the casinos are then able to take legal action. It's almost like a restraining order of sorts, that if you show up to the casino, you can be arrested. But in not all cases is that viable. So in other cases, the casino has a harder time finding out if you're there, and the punishments are less severe. I think I mentioned in the last video that if you win over $1,200 on a slot machine, that you have to get a W-2G. Turns out that a lot of people who self-exclude will eventually go back to that casino, and then they won't be found out until they win one of these big jackpots. So you can imagine a gambling addict goes back to a casino, shouldn't really be gambling at all. They're just feasting into their own addictive nature. They finally win a big hand, and then the casino comes by and says, "You've self-excluded. We're taking that money back from you." So the logic of this is to stop the people from playing, to give people a chance to stop themselves from playing. It tends to be pretty successful in some cases where there's legal action, but people have argued that maybe the casinos really aren't all that caring when it comes to policing this. That ultimately, they really are just after the revenues. I think this is a good point to mention that this is by definition, irrational behavior. It's often hard to tell when something is rational or irrational, but in economics, here's an example where we can say this is truly irrational behavior. Rational behavior would just be, if you don't want to play, just don't play. But doing something that forces you not to play, something that limits future options, is true irrational behavior. And it's rare to get these types of things in the real world where you can obviously see these things happening. So the casinos have done stuff to try to reduce problem gambling and to try to, basically reduce some of the harm. But the problem is, they also do things that encourage problem gambling. I mentioned before that alcohol use and gambling are considered to be related addictions. I think the term is their comorbidity, that people who are gambling addicts are more likely to be alcohol addicts and vice versa. So if you think about it, a lot of these casinos offer free alcohol, which is basically feeding into that demographic. Not only will the free alcohol lure gamblers, because those are the type of people who tend to be addicts, so not only does it lure them, but also it impairs their judgment. So you're doing two things there that really would create an environment where the addicts may gamble out of control. Some states have used this information to disallow this. If you've ever wondered why some states don't allow alcohol on the casino floor, some states don't offer free alcohol. A lot of times it's argued that they're trying to discourage problem gambling by making it harder to drink. This is kind of a key term. Near wins. This is a term that you'll see if you research more in gambling. This is an outcome often considered in slot machines where it appears that a player almost wins. Okay, and what you should think about here is almost winning. It usually doesn't make a lot of sense when we're thinking about slots. So what is an almost win? Well, in blackjack, let's say you've got a 20 and a dealer's got a 16, and then the dealer hits and gets the next card and it's a 5, giving them 21. Well, you can sort of imagine that was a near win. Truly, the player was expected to win there, and so it's a disappointing result that they didn't. But when it comes to slot machines, there's really no such thing as a near win. A couple of videos ago, we talked about how the way wins work on slot machines. When you press the button, immediately the machine determines whether or not you're going to win. So if the reels almost match up, that's a loss, just the same as any other loss is a loss. There's really no such thing as a near win because it's all predetermined anyway. But as it turns out, the slot machines do something to problem gamblers that they don't do to other people. If they've actually found this by looking at people's brains and hooking up electrodes to their brains, they found that the reward mechanism in addicts' brains would light up when they got a near win, where they almost won when they were playing slot machines. Addicts did that, non-addicts didn't. And so slot machines have been engineered to have a tremendous amount of near wins. A lot of times when you need to get 3 to a bonus, for example, like we saw in the Harley-Davidson game, when you need to get 3 to a bonus, if you go back and watch that last video, when the third bonus was showing up, the game slowed down, the music changed, it was building up suspense. Gambling addicts respond to that information. It actually changes the chemical nature of their brain. It gives them a thrill, right? That same type of thrill that they might get from other drugs. So, unfortunately, the type of thing that makes gaming fun, that makes it interesting, is also the type of thing that feeds in to addicts, right? I think you would agree that a slot machine where you just press a button and it just tells you whether or not you won with no histrionics at all, that would be very boring to any player. But unfortunately, making it more interesting is also going to create near wins, which is going to just feed into the addiction that some of these people have. Obviously, gambling creates thrills. That's what makes it fun for even non-gambling addicts. Thrill-seeking behaviors is something, again, that feeds into gambling addicts. And then lastly, quick response, especially in regards to slots. Gambling addicts seem to get more thrill and it becomes more problematic when the games are faster. And so there's some reasonable argument that if we're trying to limit gambling, we should try to limit the things that give you a much quicker stimulus and response mechanism. So like slots, right, very fast, feeds into the addiction very quickly, whereas something that's much more slow, something like sports betting, where you generally wait the entire game to see what happened, that doesn't so much feed into the addictive process. To make a comparison there, think about alcohol. Imagine if you drank a beer, you didn't feel it until the next day. Now let's imagine you drink 5 beers, you won't feel the alcoholic effects for a month. That's not going to really feed into the addictive process very well. For those people that are impulsive, that are predisposed to addiction, the quicker the response, the more it's driving home the desire that they have. Really the same thing with gambling addiction. The things that work faster are going to feed into that addiction more readily. So things like scratch-off tickets, they may feed into that process more than, say, Cash 3, where you're doing a lotto, right, where they're actually drawing numbers, because that's much slower. From what we know, it appears that maybe 1 to 2% of people are problem gamblers. So you think about the United States, we've got, 350 million people. That suggests that maybe there's 3.5 to 7 million people with gambling addiction. So, in our class, maybe there's no one in our class that has a gambling addiction, and it's often pretty easy to just say, don't do it. If you're addicted, don't do it. But the problem is, for these people, it's a big effect, right? This is going to have potentially a very large effect on their lives. So it only makes sense that when we're making policy decisions, that we should not ignore gambling addicts, right? It's very easy just to say, just make it legal. Why is it not legal? And even I kind of agree to that to some extent. But we do need to recognize that there are negative consequences of having fully legal gambling, especially when it gives you that quick response like slot machines do.